Every stablecoin makes the same promise. One token equals $1. Always. Not most of the time. Not in normal markets. Always. That promise is a spell. It turns a line of code into something that feels like cash. It gives traders a home base inside a casino. It gives investors a way to step out of volatility without ever leaving the table. And once people start treating that peg like a law of nature, the peg becomes more than a price. It becomes a belief. Terra USD, UST, wasn't just another stablecoin. It was the most ambitious version of the promise. It wasn't content with being stable. It wanted to be irresistible. It offered a stable dollar and somehow a near risk-free return that looked better than almost anything in traditional finance. Stability with yield, safety with profit, a dollar that paid you for holding it. And for a while, it worked so well that it started to feel inevitable. UST grew into one of the largest stablecoins in the world. Luna, the sister token that made the system run, soared. People spoke about it like a new financial primitive, a replacement for old banking rails, an algorithm that had solved what human institutions never could: stable money without centralized custody. Then, in May 2022, the promise snapped. Not slowly, not politely. It snapped like a cable under load. UST slipped below $1, and instead of bouncing back, it began to fall. Luna didn't cushion the shock. It amplified it. Within days, what had looked like a self-correcting machine became a self-destructing loop. A stablecoin turned unstable, and an ecosystem worth tens of billions turned to wreckage. So the question isn't just how Terra failed, the question is what Terra revealed. Because Terra wasn't special in the way fans believed. Terra was special in a more frightening way. It made the mechanics of collapse visible. It took the quiet fragility that lives inside financial promises and put it on full display. To understand Terra Luna, it helps to start with what a stablecoin is supposed to be. A stablecoin is a claim, a bridge between markets. In an ideal world, it's boring. It's meant to be the least exciting asset in a speculative environment. You don't buy it to get rich, you buy it to not get poor while everything else swings around you. There are stablecoins that try to keep the promise the old-fashioned way, by holding assets. If a stablecoin says it's worth $1, then somewhere there should be something like $1 worth of cash or short-term government debt or liquid instruments, a balance sheet, a set of reserves, an idea that in a panic, redemption is possible because something real sits underneath the claim. Then there are stablecoins that try to keep the promise with design instead of reserves. They don't hold dollars. They create a mechanism that is meant to behave like a dollar. They don't rely on a vault. They rely on incentives. If the peg slips, traders are rewarded for pushing it back. If demand rises, supply expands. If demand falls, supply contracts. It's an attempt to turn market behavior into a stabilizing force. That's where Terra lived. UST was algorithmic. Its backing wasn't piles of cash. It was a relationship with Luna. And that relationship was elegant enough to convince people it was inevitable. The core idea was built around conversion. The protocol offered a standing trade at a fixed concept of value. One UST could always be swapped for $1 worth of Luna. And $1 worth of Luna could be swapped to mint one UST. The protocol didn't promise to give you a dollar bill. It promised to give you $1 of Luna at the moment of redemption. In calm markets, that feels close enough to a guarantee that people stop noticing the difference. If UST trades at 99 cents, arbitrageurs can buy it cheap, swap it for $1 of Luna, and make a cent. That buying pressure pushes UST back toward $1. If UST trades at $1, but the mechanism hides a vulnerability that only matters when it matters most. The promise isn't 1 UST equals $1. The promise is 1 UST equals $1 worth of Luna. And the moment a system is under stress, the market starts asking a simple, brutal question: what is Luna worth when everyone tries to redeem at the same time? Terra's defenders described the design as decentralized central banking. They talked about seigniorage, monetary policy, algorithmic control. But stripped of vocabulary, it was simpler. UST's stability depended on Luna having sufficient market value and liquidity to absorb redemptions. Luna's value depended on Terra being trusted, used, and growing. UST was supported by Luna, and Luna was supported by belief in UST. It was a loop, and loops can be stable until they aren't. What turned that loop into a global phenomenon was not the mechanism alone. It was the engine that fed it, Anchor. Anchor was pitched as a place to earn a high, steady yield by depositing UST. The number that mattered wasn't a technical detail. It was marketing. It was psychology. It was gravity. A stable terrestrial dollar that yields close to 20% does something to people's risk perception. It doesn't just attract money. It rearranges the way the mind categorizes risk. It starts to feel less like speculation and more like a savings product. It begins to sound like a hack, like a loophole, like the kind of opportunity that only exists because others haven't noticed it yet. And when enough people believe they found a loophole, demand becomes the proof. Growth becomes the argument. The fact that it's working becomes evidence that it must keep working. But that yield raised a question that finance never forgives. Where does the yield come from? In a normal lending market, yield comes from borrowers paying interest. Money is loaned out. It generates cash flow. The yield is tied to economic activity, to someone paying for capital. In a world where deposit yields are high and steady, it usually means someone else is paying for it. In Terra's world, the yield had supports, borrowing demand, incentives, reserves designed to smooth the rate. But the system also relied on subsidies and buffers to keep the promised yield attractive. That wasn't hidden in code. It was the logic of the product. High yield was part of the growth strategy, and growth strategies have a shelf life. As long as confidence holds, the system can roll forward. New deposits arrive. The ecosystem expands. Luna's price rises, creating a sense of strength. Higher Luna valuation makes the redemption mechanism look safer. A safer-looking stablecoin attracts more capital. The cycle continues. It feels like a flywheel, like compounding, like momentum turned into stability. But the same structure that amplifies growth also amplifies fear. Because in a system like this, stability is not a property. It's the mood. When a stablecoin is fully collateralized with liquid assets, the crisis is about access and redemption. When a stablecoin is algorithmic, the crisis is about confidence and reflexivity. In a reflexive system, price doesn't just reflect reality, it changes reality. A falling price changes behavior, and behavior pushes the price further and the loop tightens. Terra tried to address that fragility with an upgrade to the story. If the mechanism depends on confidence, then add a reserve that looks like real collateral, something external, something that isn't just more of the same loop. That's where the Bitcoin reserves came in. The idea was simple. Accumulate a large pool of Bitcoin that could be deployed to defend the peg if UST came under pressure. The reserve was meant to be a backstop, a signal to the market that there was ammunition. Not just code and incentives, but a war chest. And for a moment, it sounded like maturity. It sounded like the system had learned the old truth. Confidence is strongest when it has something solid beneath it. But reserves don't eliminate fragility. They measure it. A backstop doesn't prevent a bank run. It tells you how long you can fight one. Because a bank run is not a technical problem. A bank run is a social contagion. It begins as a question, and then the question spreads faster than answers. If a few people fear the exit might close, they rush to leave. That rush becomes evidence that the fear was justified. The system can survive a run only if it can prove quickly and clearly that redemption is safe. Terra's peg held until it didn't. The exact spark is debated and argued over, but the sequence that followed is what matters. UST slipped below $1. Traders noticed. Some saw an arbitrage opportunity. Others saw a warning. Anchor deposits began to leave. A stablecoin is supposed to be boring. The moment it becomes exciting, it becomes dangerous. Excitement draws attention, and attention draws fear. When UST falls below peg, the mechanism asks arbitrageurs to step in. Buy cheap UST, redeem it for $1 of Luna. In normal times, that trade is stabilizing. It creates demand for UST and reduces its supply, pulling it back up. But the trade only works if the received asset, Luna, can be sold without collapsing its price. In a mild depeg, that's possible. In a severe depeg, the trade becomes a conveyor belt that dumps pressure into Luna. As more UST is redeemed, more Luna is minted. The supply of Luna rises. If market demand for Luna is constant, price falls. If demand for Luna is falling because confidence is breaking, price falls faster. That drop means it takes more Luna to equal $1. So for each UST redeemed, even more Luna must be minted. And with each turn of the loop, the system's backing inflates into meaninglessness. This is the death spiral, not a metaphor, a mechanism. The stablecoin's stability depends on the market's ability to absorb the volatility that redemption creates. In a panic, the redemption process itself manufactures the volatility that destroys the absorptive capacity. The exit becomes the accelerator. As UST fell further below $1, confidence didn't just weaken, it was inverted. People stopped asking, will it return to peg? And started asking, will I be the last one holding it? That's the moment stability becomes a race. In traditional finance, this is the logic of a bank run. Depositors aren't withdrawing because they want cash today. They're withdrawing because they suspect cash might not exist tomorrow. If the bank's assets are sound and liquid, the run can be stopped. If the bank's assets are tied up and contingent, the run becomes self-fulfilling. Terra's assets were contingent, not on a balance sheet, but in market perception. It could not promise redemption in dollars. It promised conversion into Luna. And Luna's ability to hold value depended on the exact thing that was collapsing: belief in the system. As the spiral accelerated, the Bitcoin reserve was deployed. That deployment was supposed to restore confidence by showing the peg could be defended. But in a panic, defense can look like desperation. Selling reserves to buy UST can slow the fall temporarily, but it can also broadcast that the system is in distress. And if the reserve is finite, traders can calculate how long the defense can last. Once the market believes it can outlast the defender, defense becomes an invitation, and so the peg continued to slip. UST fell from small cents below $1 to far below it. Luna, which was meant to be the stabilizer, collapsed under the weight of redemption. The minting mechanism expanded Luna supply dramatically. The token that had once been worth triple digits became worth pennies, then fractions of pennies. In the space of days, Luna became a lesson in hyperinflation, visible in real time on a price chart. It was an old story told at digital speed. Empires debase currency to fund promises. Confidence breaks. Prices surge. The unit of account fails. People rush into anything that feels real. The difference is that Terra's debasement wasn't done by a ruler clipping coins. It was done by a protocol minting supply to satisfy redemptions. The effect was the same. More units chasing the same faith. As the collapse unfolded, it carried an ugly clarity. UST was never a dollar. It was a promise that could be traded as if it were a dollar as long as enough people behaved as if it were true. It was a financial agreement that depended on confidence, not just existing, but staying ahead of fear. When fear overtook it, the promise didn't degrade. It broke. The aftermath didn't end at Terra. It spilled outward because Terra wasn't just a product. It was collateral, liquidity, and assumed stability inside a much larger web. Funds held UST, protocols used it, traders borrowed against it. It served as a safe base asset in strategies that depended on it being stable. When it failed, positions that were built on that stability began to unwind. Liquidations cascaded, losses spread. The idea of a stablecoin peg, already fragile in public perception, was damaged further. And in a market that runs on narratives, damaged narratives are a form of credit tightening. In the months that followed, regulators took a sharper interest in stablecoins and in the marketing of yield products tied to them. Investigations expanded, lawsuits arrived. Terra's collapse became a reference point in hearings and policy discussions, not because politicians suddenly cared about crypto as technology, but because Terra's collapse looked like a familiar failure mode, unbacked promises sold as stability. And when enough people lose enough money, the language changes. What had been described as innovation becomes described as fraud. What had been described as experimentation becomes described as deception. In every era, the same pivot happens. In a boom, risk is rebranded as opportunity. In a bust, opportunity is rebranded as misconduct. Legal consequences and bankruptcy processes began to define the wreckage. But legal processes don't restore the promise. They only assign blame and try to salvage what can be salvaged. They operate in slow motion, long after the speed of the collapse has done its work. That's another old pattern. The market moves in hours. The system responds in years. The deeper lesson of Terra Luna isn't that one project failed. It's that stability is a stronger word than most systems deserve. Stability is not a label. It's an outcome produced by structure, liquidity, and trust. And trust is not an asset that can be printed. Terra tried to manufacture trust with incentives. It tried to turn yield into credibility. It tried to treat growth as proof. But incentives are not the same thing as backing. Yield is not the same thing as safety. Growth is not the same thing as resilience. A stablecoin is, at its core, a claim on something else. If the something else is cash and liquid assets, the promise can be tested in redemptions. If the something else is an algorithmic conversion into another token whose value depends on belief, the promise becomes circular. It can work beautifully while the circle expands. It can collapse instantly when the circle contracts. And that's the uncomfortable part. Systems like Terra don't fail gradually. They fail when the market's collective story flips. The moment the story changes from this is stable to this might not be stable, every rational actor is incentivized to be early to the exit. The mechanism that was meant to restore the peg becomes the mechanism that accelerates the collapse. That doesn't mean every algorithmic stablecoin must fail. It means that any stablecoin whose stability depends primarily on confidence is living on borrowed time. Not because it's doomed in advance, but because it cannot guarantee what it needs most, the behavior of crowds under fear. Crowds don't behave like equations. They behave like animals sensing smoke. Terra Luna also revealed something about modern finance that extends beyond crypto. The modern world is saturated with promises. IOUs, liabilities, derivatives, obligations stacked on obligations. Most of the time, those promises are rolled over, refinanced, and treated as durable because the system is built to keep them durable. But durability is not immortality. It's maintenance. When maintenance fails, when confidence falters, the system does what it always does. It turns promises into losses. It decides who absorbs them. In Terra's case, the losses were absorbed by the people who treated the stablecoin promise like a guarantee, who treated the yield like an entitlement, who treated the mechanism like insurance. The winners were the ones who exited early, The ones who understood that stability is a social agreement and that social agreements can be revoked without notice. That's a cold lesson, but it's a real one. In a reflexive system, survival often belongs to the first movers, not the most loyal believers. Loyalty is not rewarded in a bank run, and that's why Terra's collapse still matters. Not because it was the biggest collapse in history, but because it was so pure. It was a clean demonstration of what happens when a financial product is built on the idea that confidence can replace collateral. When the product succeeds, it looks like genius. When it fails, it looks like a trap. The trap isn't hidden in code, it's hidden in psychology. Terra promised a stable dollar without holding dollars. It promised high yield without admitting the fragility required to sustain it. It promised an escape from the old system while recreating one of the old system's most ancient failure modes, the bank run. The speed made it feel like a new kind of disaster, but the structure was ancient. A promise of redemption backed by something that loses value when redemption is demanded. A safety guarantee that collapses under the weight of people needing it. In the end, Terra wasn't a stablecoin. It was a fragile promise wearing the mask of stability. It was a system that worked until it met the one force it could not code around: panic. Because money, in any form, is not just technology, it's trust, and trust is not a constant. Trust is a variable that behaves politely only when it feels safe. When it stops feeling safe, it doesn't fade. It leaves, and once trust breaks, the peg is no longer a price. It's a memory. So the next time a stablecoin promises certainty, the right question isn't whether the mechanism is clever. The right question is what happens when everyone wants out at once, and what exactly will be received on the other side of the promise. Because stability is not something that can be declared. It has to be paid for. And Terra showed what happens when the bill comes due.